Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa sallallahu sallam wa baraka nabi Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajmain. طيب, so we've reached chapter number 8, and that is the chapter which the Imam has entitled Babun fi al-Ruqa wat-Tama'im. The chapter regarding al-Ruqa, and we're going to explain what that refers to, and at-Tama'im. And we've already touched on at-Tama'im, but we're going to delve into those a little bit more deeply in this chapter. So now, before we start, I just want to emphasize that for the last few lessons, much of what we discussed has centered around a qa'idah, what we call qa'idat al-asbab, of the principle of causality or causation. Basically, establishing a cause and effect relationship between two things, and that this is something which is haqqullahi wahda, it is something which is the exclusive right of Allah, and is not permissible for us to establish this cause and effect relationship between two things. And if we do that, and we can't support that cause and effect relationship with a shara, with the teachings of Islam, or a tajriba al-zahira al-mubashara, we can't support it with experiential evidence which clearly establishes an identifiable connection between the cause and the effect, that in our religion is considered a shirk. And this is one of the examples that shows us that at-Tawheed, monotheism, from the Islamic perspective, is very distinct and unique from the perspective of other religions. So, for example, there's no contradiction between being a Christian and calling yourself a monotheist and believing in at-Tawheed, believing in the Trinity, or believing in certain superstitions, like that if you hang a horseshoe over your door, it will bring you good luck, or if you carry a rabbit's foot in your pocket, it will bring you good luck. They'll find no contradiction between that and being a monotheist. Whereas in our religion, we learned أن من الشرك لبس الحلقة والخيط ونحوهما لدفع الضر أو جلب منفعة. We learned that if you carry anything or wear anything and you believe that that thing can bring you some benefit or protect you from some harm, that's an act of what? Shirk. You guys see that? So our religion is very different, and one of the things that makes our religion different from the point of view or as it relates to monotheism is this qa'idah, this principle. And this chapter is another chapter that this principle is applicable to. And he's going to mention certain things which people have established a cause and effect relationship between them without any basis, and therefore they can be an act of shirk. Now, what you're going to notice in this particular chapter, in the previous chapter, he said, Babu min shirk. He said the chapter, it is from idolatry, or a form of idolatry. And then he gave he specified. But here he said, Babun fi al-Ruqa wat-Tama'im. He said the chapter regarding al-Ruqa and al-Tama'im, and he didn't say that it was shirk. He didn't say it was shirk. And the reason that he didn't do that in this chapter, although he's done it in other chapters, we mentioned the previous chapter, he mentioned it specifically, he called it shirk. And he also says in another chapter that we're going to come to, he says, for example, he says, من الشرك النظر لغير الله. It's from idolatry to make oaths for other than Allah, or to other than Allah. And he says, من الشرك أن يستغيث بغير الله أو يدعو غيره. He said it is from shirk, it is from idolatry and polytheism to seek the rescue from a threatening situation from other than Allah, or to invoke other than Allah. He mentioned specifically, but here he just said what? Babun fi al-Ruqa. He said the chapter regarding al-Ruqa, the chapter regarding at-Tama'im. Didn't call it shirk. The reason for the difference here is that not every practice of al-Ruqya, and we're going to talk about ruqya bear with me. Not every time a person practices al-Ruqya, they're committing idolatry. And not every time a person wears a tamima, which is an amulet, And we're going to talk about what that means in more detail. We've talked about it a little bit previously. Not every time a person wears an amulet are they guilty of a shirk. That there are actually some tama'im which the scholars have debated, underscore the word debated, their permissibility, right? And ar-ruqya, from ar-ruqya is, we could say, translated as incantations. It's basically words or phrases or formulas that a person recites to what? To bring about some benefit or protect from some harm. There are forms of ruqya which are acceptable and forms of ruqya which are not acceptable and actually amount to idolatry. So, but as we said in the beginning, whether we're talking about a ruqya or we're talking about a tama'im, both of them they fall under the umbrella of that qa'idah, that principle of the cause and effect relationship between things, right? That basically when people do a ruqya, when they wear a tamima, they're saying that this tamima can do what? It has the effect of protecting me from impending harm or harm that I fear or some affliction. Or if I've been afflicted, it can do what? It can remove the affliction. So you're creating what? A cause and effect relationship. And therefore, the rules and principles that we talked about previously apply. That either we're going to have a dalil, we're going to have evidence from the sharia, or we're going to have evidence from trials, experiential evidence, that people have tried it and tested it, and it has proven what? Beneficial. Otherwise, if that's not the case, and also we need to see what? We need to be able to see the connection between the cause and the effect. If these boxes, we can't check them, then we call it what? Shirk in our religion. We err on the side of caution, and it's considered what? Idolatrous, and we stay away from it. طيب. So now when the Imam says, min al-ruqa, babun fi ruqa, regarding a ruqa, he means incantations, which are words, phrases, prayers, scriptures, which are used to prevent harm or procure benefit. And again, what he means by just making it open-ended is to say that some of these are idolatrous and some of them are not idolatrous. Similarly, when he says a tama'im, he means, because he doesn't give a ruling, he means that some of these charms, some of these amulets, some of these talismans that people wear, some of them are idolatrous, and that's usually the case. And some of them, the scholars have differed about their permissibility, and that specifically relates to the tama'im, the talismans from the Quran, or al-Asma' was-Sifat. Which means if a person wears a talisman that's not from the Quran and from al-Asma' was-Sifat, what do we call it? We call it shirk, right? And the proof for that is the hadith that we took previously of Uqba ibn Amr, in which he said, "Man ta'allaqa tamimatan," he said, the Prophet said, "Man ta'allaqa tamimatan faqad ashrak." Whoever wears a talisman has what? Has committed idolatry. طيب, the only exception being the tama'im from the Quran, because the scholars throughout history have never referred to a talisman from the Quran as shirk. They've differed about whether it's permissible or not, but they never refer to it as a shirk. They consider it what? Mustathna. They consider it an exception to the rule. طيب, ar-ruqa. Ar-ruqa, we said, is these incantations, which are words, phrases, prayers, scriptures, which people use to protect themselves from harm or to remove afflictions. And there are two types. The first type is lawful. Ja'iza or shar'iyya, lawful or legal. That there are certain incantations which are lawful and legal. And the other type, what do you think it would be? Unlawful and illegal. Ahsant, ayham, mashallah, my man. All right, unlawful or illegal. But what's the proof for these two categories? The proof is the hadith of Auf ibn Malik, collected by Muslim, in which the Prophet told his companions, he said, "U'rudu alayya ruqakum. La ba'sa bil-ruqa ma lam takun shirkan." He said, present to me your incantations. What does that tell you? It tells you that the companions, before the advent of Islam, they were in the habit of treating illnesses with what? With these prayers, these words that they would say that they considered to be effective in treating certain what? Illnesses. Person gets bit by a scorpion, he would say something specific. Person feels tightness in his chest, he'll say something specific, right? Person just feels depressed and weighed down by the worries of the world. He says a certain incantation to lift what? Lift that cloud of depression. They were in the habit, they had these before Islam came, which means before the Quran and before the Hadith. You see that? So they had some ruqa, they had some incantations that they would recite that had nothing to do with Islam. So the Prophet said, "U'rudu alayya ruqakum." Let me hear these incantations that you say, that you have left over from Jahiliyyah. They're a carryover from the baggage of the period of ignorance. La ba'sa bil ruqa. There's no harm if you make an incantation, provided it doesn't contain a shirk. So if you look here, the Prophet is saying, if he says there's no harm in a ruqya as long as it's not shirk, it's telling you that there's two types of what? Ruqa. Those which are okay because they don't contain a shirk, and those which are not okay because they contain a shirk. The Prophet is establishing what? Two categories, legal and illegal. The ones that are idolatrous and the ones that are not idolatrous. So there are a few things that we see from the hadith, as we said. The companions, they had these incantations that they used to use before Islam. They weren't from the Quran because the Quran hadn't been revealed yet. They weren't from the Sunnah because the Sunnah hadn't come yet. And they had found these incantations beneficial. They used them. They were taught by their mothers and fathers and by their grandmothers and grandfathers, right? And their aunts and uncles and people that passed them down for generations. When this happens, you say this. When that happens, you say that. And they found it beneficial. So they were using them. But some of those, because they were pagans prior to Islam, some of them probably contained what? Some shirk. So the Prophet wanted to distinguish between those which are shirky and those which are not shirky, so he could tell them, hey, this one don't say it, because why? It contains a shirk. So he said to them, "U'rudu alayya ruqakum." Give me your incantations. And they're okay. I will accept them. I'll allow them, as long as they don't contain a shirk. So that lets us know that there's something called permissible, there's something called impermissible. So what are the conditions for the permissible ones? What are the conditions for the permissible ones? And this is important here. And it's important for us. We shouldn't think that it's not important for us in our day and age, because even as people who speak English and were formerly non-Muslims, we're going to find that there are things in our culture that we have a tendency to say when things happen. And some of those things are what? They're shirky. They are shirky. And we need to be careful about that. And we need to avoid those, right? So there are certain conditions of permissibility, and these conditions are unanimously agreed on by the scholars, as Ibn Hajar mentioned in Al-Fath, that the scholars have agreed that there are certain conditions for there to be something we say as what? As an incantation, which is going to lift some affliction, or it's going to prevent an affliction. So the first one is that it contains passages from the Book of Allah or His names and attributes. Obviously, anything that comes to us from the Quran or comes to us from the names of Allah or His sifat, His qualities, will be an acceptable what? Acceptable form of ruqyah. So a person, for example, he might read Surah Ar-Rahman, right? A person has a sty in his eye. And so he reads Surah Ar-Rahman, he blows in his hands and he rubs it on there. Now Surah Ar-Rahman is not a surah which we have a specific narration from the Prophet that he read it as a ruqyah. We have, for example, Ayat al-Kursi, we have al-Mu'awwidhatayn, the last two chapters of the Quran. The Prophet would read that. Al-Fatiha has been used as a ruqyah. But Ar-Rahman, no. But could somebody say it's wrong to use Ar-Rahman because we don't have a specific hadith? No, because it's from what? It's from the Quran. Right? You can use any part of the Quran as what? As a ruqyah, because Allah called the whole Quran a shifa. He called it a healing, a cure, a treatment for illnesses. You guys see that? So if it came from Allah, or it's one of His names and attributes, it can be what? It can be used mutlaqan. The second one, the second condition, is whatever words we use, they have to either be Arabiya, Arabic words, or ma yufham ma'na, or words whose meaning is understood by all concerned. You guys see that? And what that tells you, this condition that Ibn Hajar he mentioned, it tells you that the words don't have to be Arabic. They could be in any language. but the language has to be understood by all concerned. So for example, let's say that someone came from Afghanistan, okay, and he was like a scholarly, pious person, and someone was sick or ill, and they said, hey, will you please make ruqya for this person? And that person we're all English speakers. None of us speaks the Afghani language. So he starts making ruqya in Afghani. We would say what? No, you can't make ruqya for us in Afghani. And the reason is because we don't understand. And as the scholars we're going to see, the scholars like Al-Izz, Ibn Abdus Salam, and Ibn Taymiyyah, they said the danger of this, قَدْ يُلْقَى بِالشِّرْكِ. The person could actually say words which amount to idolatry, and we wouldn't know it because we don't understand the language. Or, as Ibn Taymiyyah said, قَدْ يُلْقَى بِحَرَامٍ. He could give ruqya and say things which are prohibited, and we wouldn't know it. You guys see that? And so what our Sharia does, because we're very strict in terms of our monotheism, it doesn't allow something which could potentially be idolatrous, which could potentially be illegal. It just it closes the door. And so if we can't understand the language that's being used, any member or participant can't understand the language, it would be prohibited. Suppose though we were all from Afghanistan, and the person began to give ruqya in Afghani, and we all understand it. Would that be okay? Because if he said something wrong, we would be able to what? Hey, don't say that. You can't say that. طيب. Number 3 from the conditions is the incantation, ar-ruqya, should be believed to be effective by Allah's will, not independent of Allah's will. That whatever we use, because ar-ruqya is just like any other medicine, any other cause which leads to an effect, we have to believe that that cause doesn't produce the result or bring about the outcome independent of Allah's will, but rather by Allah's will. It's just like taking what? Aspirin for a headache, right? And aspirin has been proven through experiential trials to be effective in pain relief. But we don't believe that the aspirin relieves the pain despite Allah's will, right? Independent of Allah's will, but rather by Allah's will. We have to have that belief as Muslims, right? And this is a condition for the acceptability of what? Of the ruqya. So these are 3 conditions that Ibn al-Qayyim mentioned, agreed upon in Al-Fath. Additional necessary conditions that we can understand from what he said. Number 1, the words themselves have to be permissible. They have to be permissible words. The person can't use profane language, profanity, or idolatrous language, right? If he can't say curse words, he certainly can't say words that amount to what? Shirk or disbelief. But also, we have to have some reason to believe that it's going to be what? Effective. We talked about anytime we do anything that's a cause and effect, we have to either have evidence from the Sharia or evidence from what? From experience and trials, etc. And last but not least, as we said previously, it has to be believed to be beneficial by Allah's will, not independent of Allah's will. These are the key things that we have to bear in mind when we use what? An incantation, a ruqya. And obviously the safest way when it comes to a ruqya is to stick to what? A ruqya that's been narrated, that's come from what? The Prophet ﷺ himself, or use the Quran. You guys see that? But that doesn't mean that they're the only acceptable ones. Anything outside of that is going to have to fulfill these conditions. Check these boxes. طيب. So now we said in the beginning, we said ar-ruqya is 2 forms, or I'm sorry, two types, permissible and impermissible. We talked about what the permissible one looks like. So what then would be the impermissible one? What would it look like? Every incantation that doesn't check the boxes that we just gave would fall into the category of impermissible. So, if we don't have any experiential evidence, person says some words and he says this is effective. Take these words and say these words and it will, for example, it will cure your arthritis. Right? We don't have any evidence of this, not from the hadith, not from the Quran, and not from what? Experience. It's just a person saying, I just believe this will be effective. What do we do in Islam? We err on the side of caution. We err on the side of caution. If we don't have experiential evidence, we don't have trials, clinical trials, we don't use it because it could be what? Shirk. That's what the qa'idah says. Remember, we started out with that qa'idah, that principle, the principle of causality, qa'idat al-asbab. Number 2, Another form or another indication that it's going to be impermissible is if the words that we hear or the words that are used are incomprehensible. Incomprehensible. We don't understand them. We mentioned Al-Izz ibn Abdus Salam. He said, قَدْ يُرْقَى بِالشِّرْك. The person could actually say things which are idolatrous, polytheism. He could call on the jinn. He could call on Satan. He could call on evil spirits. And we wouldn't even know because we don't understand the language. And Ibn Taymiyyah, he said, قَدْ يُرْقَى بِالْحَرَامِ أو الْمُحَرَّمِ. He said that he could be making incantations and saying things which are prohibited, impermissible, like profanity, right? He could be saying profane things, right? And there are certain statements that are common in our culture, commonly used in our language. And maybe we, without realizing in certain situations, will actually say these words and fall into what? The impermissible incantation. I'll give you some examples. Beelzebub. You guys ever heard that before? Beelzebub. Some people might not even know what that means. It actually means the devil or the main devil. Another example, hocus pocus. Ever heard that one? Hocus pocus. That's another one. It's an incantation, right? And it's words we don't know what they really mean. And some people say that they were taken from Latin but like twisted, and they don't have a real meaning in Latin. They don't have a real meaning in Latin. Why? Because the words have been twisted, certain vowels have been inserted, and so it doesn't mean. Another one, very common, abracadabra. Ever heard that one? We hear it all the time, don't we? Abracadabra. And that actually means, if you look up the meaning of it, it means unintelligible language. Words that are incomprehensible. That's what abracadabra means. It's like I'm using these words, nobody knows what they mean, and I'm using them to what? To bring about some result. And it's used a lot by who? Who's that used a lot by? Magicians. Isn't that so? Abracadabra. And I'm trying to remember, I don't know, I don't want to date myself, but I grew up watching I Love Lucy reruns. And there was a statement that Ricky Ricardo used to make all the time. And it's a statement in Spanish. And I remember when I first became Muslim, saying it to another Muslim friend who was Latino, and he said, don't say that. Don't say that because it has a negative meaning in Spanish. And he would actually say this, and people who watch that show will do what? Will pick up that language and start repeating it. So I say all that to say is that there are lots of words that may be in our language. We don't know what they mean. They became part of our culture. And situations arise and we just what? We say them without thinking, and we could actually be saying something which amounts to what? Shirk. And this is what the Prophet meant when he said, "U'rudu alayya ruqakum." Present to me your ruqa, your incantations. They're okay as long as they don't contain what? A shirk. What if we don't know if they do or don't? What should we do as Muslims? Err on the side of caution. You guys see that? And don't say these types of words. Last but not least, from the impermissible forms would be if the incantation is believed to be effective, independent of Allah's will. We emphasize that, and we emphasize it here again. It's like, for example, a person says, huwa. Huwa, which literally means in Arabic, he. And some people say it's a name of Allah. It's not a name of Allah. But they believe that this word, huwa, some of them say it's the greatest name of Allah. Again, it's not even a name of Allah, let alone the greatest name of Allah. But some of them will say it and they believe that it has power. It has power, and if you say it, it will bring about this result or prevent this harm. And it will do that what? Regardless. It never fails. You guys see that? These types of beliefs that we allow ourselves to have, again, they contradict the fundamentals of at-Tawheed. Right? Tafadali.
I'll wait until you finish.
Okay.
Okay, this section. I want to ask you.
Oh, sure. All right. So now, after that, the Imam, he said, at-Tama'im. He said, Babun fil ruqa wa tama'im. So we talked about these incantations, or ruqya, or ruqa. Now he transitions to what? At-Tama'im. At-Tama'im is a word which is derived from tamma yatimmu, which means to be completed. And basically, when we talk about at-Tama'im, it's something which is adopted to complete the benefit or advantage. Complete. To make the benefit, the advantage what? Complete. To fulfill it. To make it reach what? Its maximum potential. So the person basically, what they're saying is, I'm wearing this because I believe it will what? It will benefit me. It will benefit me. It will bring somewhat, some benefit. Whatever benefit exists, it will what? It will complete that circle. It will bring about this advantage. And that benefit may or may not be what? Be confirmed. But he believes it's going to benefit him, and so he what? He wears it. These amulets, more often than not, we'd say 99.9% of the time, they are what? They are idolatrous. When a person's wearing something with that intention, whatever he's wearing is automatically, it enters the realm of what? Shirk. And that's because the hadith, we've talked about it repeatedly, Uqbat ibn Amr, collected by Ahmed, in which the Prophet said, Man ta'allaqa tamimatan faqad ashrak. Whoever wears an amulet has committed idolatry. That's the original rule, the basic rule of thumb. Person wears something that says, hey, this is going to protect me. That's shirk. You guys see that? This is important because lots of people, Muslims, wear what? Wear amulets and believe that they'll protect them, right? Tayyib. And this is especially true when there's no proof of what? Their effectiveness. Because remember the principle that's at the center of what we've been talking about the last few weeks is that principle of causality or causation, that when you think something can produce a particular effect and you don't have any evidence from the Quran and you don't have any evidence from experiential evidence, right? Trials. And you can't see a clear connection between the cause and the effect, automatically in our religion is considered what? A shirk, because of the hadith of Uqbat ibn Amr. Tayyib. Let me see. So now let's go to the explained what we're talking about. We're clear on what the meaning is of ar-ruqa, incantations and talismans and amulets. Let's go now to the actual narrations that he gives to support what he's saying, that some of these ruqa and some of these talismans are shirk and some of them are not shirk. Wa alaykum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Tayyib. So the first one is a hadith of Abu Bashir Al-Ansari. أنه كان مع رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم في بعض أسفاره فأرسل رسولا أن لا يبقين في رقبة بعير قلادة من وتر أو قلادة إلا قطعت. So he said he was in the company of Allah's Messenger on one of his journeys. And Allah's Messenger صلى الله عليه وسلم, he sent a messenger ordering, there shall not remain any necklace or bowstring or any other kind of necklace around the necks of camels except that it should be cut off. So he ordered that these qala'id, these necklaces, be cut off from around the necks of the animals. Now, pay attention with me, ikhwan wa khawat. The necklace or the qilada that the Prophet ﷺ prohibited it being around the necks of the animals, that he obviously noticed in one of his journeys, he saw that some of the animals had these what? These necklaces around their necks. He mentioned specifically min watar. Watar, back in the day, the ancient times, when people would make a bow for bows and arrows, right? They have to have what? A string. And they have to have a certain type of string. Something that's going to maintain what? Its tightness, right? Or its tension. And something which is not going to easily wear out. So what they commonly would do is they would take the nerve fibers or nerve strands of animals. They would take those nerve strands and they would use that as what? As the string for their bow, right? They would use that as a string for their bow. They were also in the habit, the pagans were, of taking those nerve fibers, those nerve strands, and putting them around the necks of their animals, believing that those fibers could protect their animals from being afflicted, Now in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about those camels and those animals which are driven for Hajj, and they have what? A qilada. You guys know, like when we talk about the qilada here, you know how, for example, you've probably seen pictures or films or whatever, where people land in Hawaii, and when they land in Hawaii, they put what? They put, right, what is it called? All right. That's the type of qilada that a lot of times are put on what? On camels when they're driven to what? Hajj. And that qilada is perfectly what? Permissible. In fact, it's what? It's recommended. It's like you're making the camel, which is ultimately going to be what? Slaughtered for the sake of Allah. You're what? You're dressing it up. You're embellishing it. You're beautifying it. So this qilada is okay. It's shara'i or shara'iyya. It's allowed. It's permissible. It's recommended. And this qilada is not permissible. What's the difference? The difference is one was worn with the intention of what? Protection. Bringing about some benefit or protecting from some harm. So when the Prophet saw them wearing these qala'id min watar, which is a specific type of material that they would use for protection, he said, I don't want to see any animal with watar around its neck except that what? It's cut off. So he didn't prohibit the camel wearing a necklace, but he did prohibit it wearing a necklace from what? From something which was associated with what? Idolatry or idolatrous beliefs. You guys see that? Pay attention to that because it's going to be important a little later. طيب ثم بعد ذلك, why did he prohibit it? And I'm going to see if you guys have been paying attention these last 3 weeks. Why did he prohibit specifically this watar or this qilada, this necklace from watar? تفضل.
One of the reasons that he prohibited those things is because they meant it in a way of protection.
Ahsan. Now why is that wrong? Why would that cause him to tell him, get that off of there? Aham? Why is it shirk though? What's the qa'idah we gave?
Because they think it is to protect the camel.
Okay, good. So anytime we believe that something can protect you from harm or bring about some benefit, we create this cause and effect relationship between two things. And we can't support it with the shara. Or we can't support it with experiential evidence. Automatically in our religion we call it, what's the proof? The hadith of Uqba. Man ta'allaqa tamimatan faqad ashrak, right? The Prophet said, whoever wears a talisman, believing it can protect them, he has already what? Committed idolatry. You guys see that? Just remember that's why the Prophet, that's what motivated the Prophet to what? To take it off. Okay? Now notice he talked specifically about camels. He talked about camels. Is that not so? But does that mean he was telling us it only applies to camels? You could, for example, you could put a watar on a cow with that intention? Could you put a watar on your car? Could you put like a wolf's skin on your car, believing in it would? So what the Prophet is telling us is that this ruling encompasses everything which something is hung around it or draped on it with what? With the intention of preventing harm or procuring benefit. Without evidence, you have no evidence to support it, not from Islamic teachings or from clinical trials or experience, etc. Now, what about air fresheners? So for example, I have in my car, I hang these like little trees from my mirror. And sometimes I hang it, on the back, you have those little handles. I'll put it on there too, so I have a nice smell in the car. So now could somebody get in the car and say, A'udhu billah, hadihi tamima. This is what? This is a talisman. This is an amulet. And the Prophet commanded, right, that there should not be anything hung on a mode of transport. And he starts ripping down my trees, stomping on them. Would that be right? Would that be acceptable? No. Did the Prophet prohibit hanging something just for the sake of hanging it?
No.
Did he prohibit hanging something for a genuine benefit like having a nice smell? He prohibited for hanging it with the intention of what?
Protection.
Protection, benefit for tafadali. What was your intention? Right, because it could be an acceptable intention or unacceptable. So there was actually someone who was commenting on Kitab, at-Tawheed, and he mentioned this hadith, and he said air fresheners are not permissible. You have to take those air fresheners that hang, you have to take them out. That's not what the Prophet is saying. He's not saying you can't hang anything on anything. But he's saying you can't hang anything on anything with that what? with that specific intention. That's why he prohibited al-watar. He prohibited those fibers, those nerve fibers, because that's what they were commonly used for in al-Jahiliyyah. Tayyib. What about face masks? You know, we're coming out of the COVID era where everybody had like 3 or 4 face masks in their car, and sometimes they would hang them, right? You know how like you have your blinker, and you have your windshield wiper on this side. Some people will hang it on that. Some people will hang it from their rear view mirror. So you got these masks hanging all over the place. Somebody gets in there and they start ripping your mask down. Like, what's wrong with you, man? Right? Man ta'allaqa tamimatan faqad ashrak. Is it okay to hang mask in your car?
Yeah.
Yeah, because your intention is just to what? To have it handy. Your intention is not to believe that it has what? It has any benefit. Like, give you another example. What about those of us who work in an environment where you have to have an ID badge? And most people will put their ID badge on some type of what? Lanyard. Is that not so? So you can just put it around your neck. You're not digging in your pocket or digging in your purse or digging in your wallet to what? To find your ID. It's just what? It's always hanging there. I get to the door and I have to swipe in, or I have to buzz in, or whatever I have to do. It's right there. I just beep, and I just go in, whatever it is. A lot of in that situation. When we get off of work, we don't want to put it someplace and then forget it. We don't want to bring it, for example, into the house, lay it on the dresser, run out of work, running late the next day, get to work, and you can't get in because you don't have what? Your ID badge. So what do we typically do? Hang it on the rearview mirror, right? So what about that? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Why is it okay, Hatim? I don't know. The Prophet said, "Man ta'allaqa tamimatin faqad ashrak."
It's permissible because you didn't do it in like signs of protection, stuff like that.
So it goes back to the intention. I'm just doing this to what? For convenience. So it'll be here when I come tomorrow. But another thing that's very common that people hang is they hang these crepe streamers, crepe party streamers. You know that paper? It's really like crunchy, and you can stretch it out and you can hang it, and people will hang it as a decoration. People will hang it for parties that they're going to throw. You'll see that commonly. And sometimes people actually put it on their car if there's like some special occasion, like a graduation or something. You'll see people driving around with crepe paper draped all over their car, and they'll have like that, they'll take soap or whatever, and they'll write in the windshield, congratulations to our 2022 graduate, whatever it is, right? So this crepe paper, with this intention of what? Being festive. Would that be something that would be shirk?
No,
Why not, Hussam?
because the intention is for decoration.
Ahsan, the intention decoration. So you guys got it. But let's go to the next one. Ibn Mas'ud, he narrated that he heard Allah's Messenger saying, Inna ruqa wa tama'ima wa tiwalata shirk. He said he heard the Messenger of Allah saying, Inna ruqa, indeed, incantations. And at-Tama'im, amulets and talismans. What tiwala, and we're going to talk about what tiwala means shortly, shirk. So now, obviously, when Ibn Mas'ud mentions that ar-ruqa, and he mentions it without exception, when he says ar-ruqa are a shirk, he's obviously talking about ar-ruqya that's not from what? Doesn't fulfill the conditions we talked about. We know this because the Prophet used to perform ruqya for himself and for others. And obviously the Prophet would not perform a ruqya which was shirkiyah. So ar-ruqya, when he says that, when the Prophet says ar-ruqa shirk, he means what? Those ruqa which are not from the permissible category. They don't check the boxes for permissibility. The same thing is true for what? At-Tama'im. And we're going to talk about the Tama'im which are an exception to the rule, which is the Tama'im in the Quran. So the same thing he's saying there. Any tamima, which is not from the permissible category, which is the ones from the Quran or Allah's names and attributes, would be what? A shirk. A tiwala is a type of magic. And it was a magic that was commonly performed in al-Jahiliyyah. And unfortunately, it's a type of magic which is not uncommon in Muslim circles. And basically, what is this form of magic? It's a form of magic where a person will do something to try to make a man incline toward his wife, love his wife, or a woman inclined toward what? Her husband. So it's not uncommon, for example, for a woman to feel that her husband is beginning to what? To withdraw, to pull away. And that his eyes are what? Are shifting towards someone else. So that woman may go to someone who engages in what? In magic. And say, I want you to put a spell on my husband which will make him what? Adore me. Which will make him infatuated with me. Which will make him transfixed on me and he won't look at other women. This is what they call what? A tiwala, right? A tiwala, love spell, good. So a tiwala, that's what it is. So these are the three things that the Prophet mentioned in the hadith. Ar-ruqya, and we mean ar-ruqya that's impermissible. At-tama'im, again, those which are not from the Quran. And last but not least, at-tiwala, which is this type of what? Magic. All of them are what? Shirk. All of them are polytheism. Then after that, the Imam, he gives examples, or he wants to go and explain the alfaz in the hadith of Ibn Mas'ud. So we'll read that and just comment briefly on the commentary of the Imam. So he says, at-tama'im, which is these amulets and charms, is the act of putting an amulet around the necks of children to save them from the effects of the evil eye. Here the Imam is giving us an example. He's not saying this is the only way that amulets are used or the only type of impermissible amulet, but it's the common way that people what? Use amulets. They'll put something to protect what? Their kids, right? But he's saying that's not the only one, but it's a common example. That's why I'm giving this example. Then he says, if the amulet contains the verse of the Quran or Allah's names or attributes, then it is allowed. So, Allah this way. Just want to make sure I don't forget to say what I wanted to say about that. Allah this way, let me just make sure. Wa alaikum yarhamukallah. All right. Okay. So, he said that if the amulet contains the verse of the Quran or Allah's names or attributes, then it is allowed by some of the pious predecessors and disallowed by some. So here, there's two things. One is he's telling us that there's a difference of opinion about amulets which are from the Quran. That some scholars, as early as the period of the companions, have differed about or debated about the permissibility of amulets from the Quran. The first opinion is that they are absolutely prohibited. And this is the opinion attributed to Ibn Mas'ud. Although the sanad, the chain, is not a good chain. The next opinion is that attributed to Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As, that it's what? It's absolutely permissible. Absolutely permissible to wear an amulet from the Quran. From the Quran. And the last opinion is a tafsil, meaning that it depends. It depends if it was before a person was afflicted. He wore it for protection. He couldn't do it. But if it was after he was afflicted and he put on the tamima, that would be permissible. And that's the opinion attributed to Aisha authentically from Al-Hakim in his Mustadrak. So, the scholars have these three opinions about at-tama'im min al-Quran. What that tells us is that this is one of those permissible differences. So if somebody wore a tamima from the Quran, then we wouldn't say absolutely they're doing something wrong. We wouldn't rip it off of their neck and throw it as far as we could see. But we might say it's better if you what? If you don't do that, especially if you haven't been what? Been afflicted. But we couldn't say it's absolutely haram. Why? Because the scholars traditionally have differed about it. طيب ثم بعد ذلك he says الرقى or al-azaim is the act of reciting incantations. Those are allowed in which there is no trace of shirk, and we talked about the hadith of Auf ibn Malik اعرضوا علي رقاكم لا بأس بالرقى ما لم تكن شركا. And then he said that present to me your incantations. There's no problem with incantations as long as they don't contain shirk. And the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he says, has permitted in case of being bitten by poisonous insects or disturbed under the effect of the evil eye. Again, this is an example of, this is just an example. The Prophet did not intend to say you can only do ruqya when you've been bitten by a scorpion or you've been affected by the evil eye. Why? Because the Prophet himself used to make ruqya for himself every night before sleeping. So it's okay to do ruqya for what? For any illness, right? طيب, last but not least, at-Tawheed, we talked about what that means. And then the Imam, he brings a few other narrations. The first one he brings is the one of Abdullah ibn Uqaym, narrated by he narrated the following marfu hadith, in which he said, "Man ta'allaqa shay'an wukila ilay." Whoever uses, attaches, or wears a talisman to himself will have that talisman put in charge of him. Now, obviously, he's saying this generally, any talisman, right? But what he actually means is a talisman which is used with the intention of protecting from harm or bringing about some benefit. So if a woman wears a necklace for a zina, just to look pretty, right? Is she now going to be entrusted to that thing? Is her affairs going to be entrusted to that thing? She's totally what? Left to the mercy of that thing? No. But if she did it with the intention that's going to protect her, that's when what? She will be left to the mercy of that thing, or put in charge. That thing will be put in charge of her, etc. Then after that, he mentions the hadith like by Ahmed from Ruwayfa. From Ruwayfa. Ya Ruwayfa, لعل الحياة ستطول بك فأخبر الناس أن من عقد لحيته أو تقلد وترا أو استنجى برجيء دابة أو عظم فإن محمدا بريء منه. So in this hadith, the Prophet mentioned a few things, and he said that whoever does those things, the Prophet will be bari', he'll be free of him. So what do you think? If the Prophet says, if you do X, Y, and Z, I'm what? I'm free of you. Do you think that's a good thing or a bad thing?
It's terrible.
How bad? Is it bad to the point that it's whatever he's talking about is a major sin? The scholars say yes. If the Prophet goes so far as to say that he's free of whoever does something, it means that whatever they did is what? Is a major sin. The Prophet would not say that for a minor sin, let alone something which is permissible, right? So these things that he mentioned, these three things he mentioned, are pretty serious. The first one he mentions was aqada lihyatahu. He does what? He braids or ties his beard. Now, braiding and tying the beard is not something which in itself is not permitted. So, if the Prophet says that, he must mean doing it in a way or with an intention that is impermissible. Do you guys see that? So the scholars of Islam, they said either the Prophet is saying he ties up or braids his beard ala wajh al-kibr. He does it out of what? Wa alaykum salam. He does it out of arrogance. And there probably was at that time, and I wouldn't doubt there are people at this time, who when they braid their beard, it's a sign of what? Of being a big shot. You guys see that? There are probably some people in certain cultures, when they braid their beard or tie it up a certain way, that's a sign that what? They're from a certain class of people. They're a big shot. They're important. And the Prophet is saying, whoever does that, then what? Ana bari'un min. Right? Another way, another explanation the scholars gave, is that the person ties up his beard ala wajhin, tashabbuhan bin nisa, or ala wajh tashabbuh bin nisa. That he does it in a way which resembles what? The braids that women put what? In their hair. It makes him look effeminate, right? It makes him look effeminate. So these are the two ways that would make it what? A kabira, a major sin, and something which the Prophet would be free of the person who does that. The second one, he said, qallada wataran. That he what? He takes something, whether he puts it on himself or puts it on an animal, he takes one of those what? Those fibers from the nerves of an animal and does what? And wears it as a necklace, or puts it on what? On his mode of transport, with the intention of what? Protection. And we've already talked about that, right? We mentioned that in the first hadith, the hadith of Abu Bashir and Al-Ansari. And then last but not least, he tells us, أو استنجى برجيء دابة أو عظم. He said that the person who, when he goes to the toilet and he goes to clean himself. Now back in the day, we have Charmin and we have all these things, and people don't generally use other dry things. But back in the time of the Prophet, they would use anything dry. They would use stones. They would use leaves. They would use tree stems, whatever, to what? To cleanse themselves. But there were certain things that the Prophet told them you can't use. So you can't use, for example, the dung of an animal, right, to cleanse yourself. And you can't use the bone of an animal to cleanse yourself. And the Prophet, he said that you can't do that, and if you do that, it's so disgusting in Islam. It's so not acceptable in Islam that ana what? Ana bari'un minhu. I am free from him. طيب, last but not least, we have the statement of Sayyid ibn Jubair. No, that's not last. Second to last. He said, من قطع تميمة من إنسان كان كعدل رقبة. Whoever cut an amulet or talisman from anyone, it will be equal to liberating a slave. It's as if he's saying that our religion is so keen to avoid shirk that if you see somebody doing something which amounts to shirk, or you suspect it's shirk, you should do what? You should immediately put a stop to it, even though it means what? Violating their personal space and taking something which is their possession, getting it off them. He's saying this is something not only you should do it, it's virtuous to do it, right? And that's just, again, emphasizing the importance of it in our religion. Tafadhal, Hussein.
What if you get arrested by it?
Huh?
What if you get arrested by it?
Invested?
Arrested.
Arrested. No. I mean, we wouldn't do that necessarily, but he's saying it to emphasize how important it is in the religion, right? That it's virtuous to go to this extent to enjoin good and forbid evil when it relates to what? A shirk. Then last but not least, he mentions Al-Waki', who mentioned or who related the last hadith from Sayyid ibn Jubair, or the statement from Sayyid ibn Jubair. He said he also reported from Ibrahim al-Nakha'i that they, and underscore the word they, used to dislike every type of amulet and talisman, whether that contained the verse of the Quran or anything else. And they refers to the ashab of Ibn Mas'ud. It refers to what? Ibn Mas'ud and his pupils. Ibn Mas'ud and his pupils. That's what we said the first opinion regarding talismans, whether they're from the Quran or not from the Quran, is that they're what? Totally what? Prohibited. So that opinion is there, and it's been attributed to Ibn Mas'ud and his pupils. And with that, we have covered the 8th chapter of Kitab, at-Tawheed. And again, all of these chapters that we're in right now, they revolve around this principle. And he's giving us different examples to help us thoroughly understand how to practice and apply the principle in our everyday life. Because we have to understand that the reality of our ummah, of our religious community, is that a shirk has occurred. There has been Muslim idolaters. Even though that sounds like a huge oxymoron, there is something called Muslim idolaters, Muslims who engage in polytheism, idolatry. How did that happen? It happened because ignorance was allowed to seep in. People didn't learn these principles. They learned at-Tawheed in a very shallow, superficial way. And so when it came to certain practices, they didn't recognize those blind spots. They developed these blind spots and they didn't recognize those blind spots, and they started what? It's not uncommon. Some of you probably have met people and talked to people who what? They wear amulets. They hang amulets in their cars, right? My daughter says she goes to school with a girl who wears a bracelet with what? With that eye on it. There's a young man who wears a necklace with the eye on it. No doubt his parents probably every day send him to school, kiss him on the head and say what? Wear this, it'll protect you. Like, how does that happen? You guys remember the one time an Nahas was here and he was giving examples from his own culture and from his own country. They do this and they do this and they do this. So these things happen because, again, we develop these blind spots because we don't what? We don't study. We don't learn. And I understand. When you compare this topic to other topics, it's dry at times, right? It's highly academic. We're talking about conditions, wahid, ithnain, thalatha, right? You have these different conditions for this, and box you have to check, and so on and so forth. And sometimes it can be mentally what? Taxing. You don't have to get everything that's said. You don't have to memorize every word. But if you leave with an understanding of the principle, every time we come and we look at it, for example, لبس الخيط ونحوهما لبس الحلقة والخيط ونحوهما لدفع الضر أو جلب منفعة, right? So he talks about wearing like a band or a bracelet or wearing some twine to protect you from harm or bring about some benefit. Then he comes and he says الرقى والتمائم. He talks about incantations. He talks about amulets. Then now he's going to come about talking about tabarruk, seeking what? Barakah, blessings from different things. All of them revolve around what? This principle establishing a cause and effect, believing that something can bring about some benefit or protect you from some harm. If we understand that principle, we don't have to know all of the details. We don't have to memorize a hadith, but we're going to get in situations where we're going to see either ourselves tempted or other people actually engaging in believing that something can what? Benefit them or harm them. And we're going to know what? We can't do that. And we're going to know what? Why? Even if we can't articulate it, we understand internally, we've internalized that this can't be done in Islam. And this is considered what? Shirk. And that'll protect us from deviating. And so the information is critically important. We have to study it. And I'm trying not to make it too technical. But these chapters are so important because they're foundational. It gets easier once we go because what? The principles are there. We just go. Why is this? Al-Qaeda, the principle. Next thing. Why is this? And you can see that we'll start taking what? 3 and 4 chapters. But it's pretty much one chapter, a lesson. Why? Because we're building the foundation. And once the foundation is strong, the building does what? It stands. It stands firm. But if the foundation is weak, the building can what? Can easily be demolished. And with that, we bring today's session to a call. Any questions, comments, or critiques? Tafadali, then we'll go with the brother.
Okay, I have 2 things. The first one is with the incantations and the words and what have you. One thing that's common now is mantras.
Mm-hmm.
People, like, they say mantras because they believe, like, when I say these things, it's self-empowering. So
I can speak into existence.
Exactly.
Uh-huh.
So, like, for instance, you know, I'm the wind, I'm fast, I'm like a horse. Like, they'll continue to say things over and over and over again, which is a type of incantation. One mantra that even in school, kindergarten, the teacher will have the children say every day. Some of those things are good. I'm smart. I can do my best today. So when you say these things, it empowers you and keeps it subconsciously and conscious that in your conscious that you're going to perform well. That's the intention behind it. Part of one of her mantra was, I can do all things. Exactly. So it's things like this that even like we have to think about and question when we hear these types of mantras or what have you, when we might go to self-help, self-awareness things, because they will say these things and you're supposed to repeat it and believe it, and you might not see any harm in it because you're empowering yourself. But to say, I can do all things, you can't.
Yeah.
The other thing too was ruqya. Something that I didn't hear us touch on this class, I believe you did it in another class, or maybe it was earlier, was about how the ruqya, like we perform ruqya on ourselves, or if someone else is ill or has an ailment, we perform ruqya on them. But from what I understand, we're not supposed to ask for ruqya to be performed on us by somebody else, nor are we supposed to like go out and seek a specific person to do that. Is that correct?
Specific person.
Yes.
Okay. So we have 2 things. And part of the confusion that comes with talab al-ruqya, like seeking a ruqya, is because there's a version of the hadith of the 70,000. There's a version of hadith where the Prophet said about the 70,000, La yastarqun. And it uses the prefix that indicates what? Seeking a ruqya, the alif sin ta. La yastarqun. But the actual hadith, when you go back to the original texts, is yarqun. They don't what? They don't do a ruqya. They don't do a ruqya. It's not yastarqun. Right? And so what the Prophet ﷺ is saying is that they don't do the ruqya, which is shirkiyah. Not that they don't do ruqya shar'iyah. And that version which says ya la yastarqun is not a confirmed version. The actual version is la yarqun. But a ruqya itself, the actual legal acceptable ruqya, is not something which will take you out of being from the 70,000, because the Prophet himself used to what? Do a ruqya for himself and do a ruqya for others. طيب. So seeking a ruqya from others, there's no harm in it. Although the best thing is to what? To make ruqya for yourself. And it's dangerous to seek ruqya from a specific person unless that person is specifically skilled, right? He specializes in a ruqya. So there's some people who they actually specialize, just like, because a ruqya is a form actually of medicine. So there's some people who they actually specialize in a ruqya as a form of medicine, specifically as a way to do exorcisms, right? So if a person is specifically skilled and they have experience and they've had success, and a person is experiencing something like that, and they actually actively seek someone who has that skill, there's no harm in that whatsoever. But a person shouldn't be the type of person who he's not targeting someone who has that specific skill or has been successful in treating people using a ruqya, but he just thinks this person is what? They're pious. And somehow their ruqya is going to be more effective than their ruqya for me is going to be more effective than my ruqya for myself. We shouldn't do that, because it's a fitna for ourselves and it's a fitna for the person themselves. When you go to that person and you say, hey, will you make ruqya for me? Right? Especially if you go on and you embellish and you say, hey, because I just think you're such a pious person, you're so close to Allah. That right there is a fitna for you, because you're imagining this person as being what? Special and especially capable of bringing about the healing. So your heart now is attached to the person, or attached to what? Allah. It's attached to who? The person. And what did we say that's going to prevent us from falling into a shirk? What was one of the conditions? That we have to believe that whatever we're doing is going to benefit us by the will of Allah, not the will of what? Of the thing itself. So when a person starts saying, hey, because you're this and because you're that, his heart is starting to do what? Incline toward the person and what he's going to do, as opposed to what? Allah himself. That's a fitna for them. It could be a fitna for the person, because the person starts to what? Starts to think of themselves as being special or especially capable of achieving the outcome, etc. Not by Allah's will, but by themselves. And الشيء بالشيء يذكر, because you mentioned that, it made me think of a story that Ibn Taymiyyah, he mentioned from Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah, he was once asked by a man to perform exorcism for him. And so he began like reading some verses from the Quran, and the man's jinn was communicating with Ibn Taymiyyah. And he was telling the jinn to come out. And he was reciting verses from the Quran and doing the things that people do when they exorcise somebody. So the jinn, he kept refusing. So he said to him, he said, come out by the will of Allah. And the jinn, he said, I will come out takriman li taqiyuddin, the Sheikh Taqiyuddin. He said, I'm going to come out of honor and respect for Sheikh Taqiyuddin. What was he trying to do? He was trying to get him to shirk. I'm going to come out for your sake. So he said, La, don't come out for my sake. Come out for the sake of who? Of Allah. And he came out. Al-Muhim, I say that to say that we have to be very careful. People who do this type of thing have to be very careful. Not to what? Not to fall in love with themselves. Not to make it about themselves. It's always about what? You being a vessel or a tool or a means to achieve what? Allah's end, not your own end, right? Like, Father Sheikh, you had something real quick.
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit, but I still get a little confused, right? Like, you say you wear the evil eye amulet. We know that that's definitely not right. Let's say you were to wear the words of the Quran, but you don't really necessarily bring the whole tie into this reminds me of Allah, therefore I feel protected by it because of Allah. And
Mhm.
so you just say I feel protected because I have the amulet on my chest.
Eh?
At that point, is it still a shirk?
Wallahi, the scholars of Islam have never described an amulet from the Quran as shirk. So we wouldn't say it because they haven't described it as such.
Okay.
But a person is entering dangerous territory. Why? Because we said any amulet that we're going to wear, we have to believe that it's going to help us in anything we do. I don't want to say any amulet because the only the acceptable one would be one from the Quran. But anything that we do, and we establish this cause and effect relationship, and there is support for it, we have to do it with the intention and the belief that it is successful, it's effective by Allah's will. As soon as we don't do that, as soon as we stop doing that, stop believing that it's effective by Allah's will, we enter into what? Generally, the category of a shirk. But the reason why we don't say that when it comes to this, the amulet from the Quran, is because the scholars haven't said that. But we're entering at least into what? Dangerous territory, because we have to believe everything is effective by Allah's will. We talked about this, I think last week or the week before. We said, La sababa tamun illa mashiat Allah. There is no cause which is absolutely effective except Allah's will. Everything else is subject and subservient to Allah's will. And so we have to believe that. So if a person did wear the tamima, he has to believe it's effective, by Allah, not independent of itself, not this metal, right? Not this precious metal, gold, silver, platinum, whatever a person's wearing with the Quran on it. He doesn't believe that itself. Now, if he believes that the metal, then yeah, it won't be shirk.
Yeah.
But if he was, no, it's the amulet, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's the amulet by Allah's will. We can't say shirk because he's saying it's by Allah's will. He says, no, it's independent of Allah's will, right? Then what? We're saying what? Dangerous territory. What do we label it? We can't label it shirk because scholars haven't done that traditionally. But what? You're in dangerous territory because you have to always believe everything that happens is by Allah's will. Okay. هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.